The banquet hall was filled with a soft, golden light that bounced off the crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. It was the kind of room where everything felt expensive, from the thick carpet underfoot to the heavy velvet curtains that covered the windows. The air smelled of roast beef, expensive perfume, and fresh flowers. At round tables all over the room, adults sat in stiff chairs, laughing and talking. They were dressed in their finest clothes, with men in dark suits and women in colorful dresses and shiny jewelry. It was a fancy party for a very important occasion, and everyone there seemed to know exactly how to act. Everyone, that is, except for the little boy sitting near the back wall. His name was Toby. He was 7 years old. Small for his age, with messy brown hair that his mother had tried to comb flat earlier that evening. He wore a white button-up shirt that felt a little too tight around the neck and dark dress pants that were slightly too long, bunching up over his shiny black shoes. He sat perched on the edge of a velvet chair that was much too big for him, swinging his legs back and forth because his feet couldn't reach the floor. In his hands, he held a glass of sparkling apple juice, gripping it tightly with both hands as if it were a precious treasure. Toby felt out of place. He wasn't a guest, and he wasn't part of the staff. He was just there because his mother was working hard as a server for the event. She had told him to stay at this table, behave himself, and drink his juice while she carried trays of food back and forth. He promised he would be good. He always tried to be good for her. But while the other children who might have been there would have been running around or playing games on tablets, Toby was perfectly still. His eyes weren't on the cake or the ice cream sculpture on the buffet table. They were fixed on the front of the room. There, on a small wooden stage raised above the floor, sat the most beautiful thing Toby had ever seen. It was a grand piano. It was huge, painted in a deep, glossy black that reflected the lights of the room like a mirror. It was curved and elegant, with the lid propped open to show the strings inside. To the adults in the room, it was just furniture, background music for their dinner. But to Toby, it looked like a sleeping beast waiting to wake up. He watched the man who was playing it. The pianist was older, with silver hair and a suit that looked even more formal than what the guests were wearing. He sat on the bench with his back straight, moving his fingers quickly across the keys. The music drifted through the air-smooth, fancy jazz that made the adults nod their heads. Toby didn't know the name of the song, but he loved the sound. He loved how the low notes rumbled in his chest and how the high notes sounded like little bells. He found himself tapping his foot along with the rhythm, careful not to make too much noise against the chair leg. Toby knew a lot about the piano, though he had never touched one this nice. At home, there was an old upright piano in the living room. It was scratched, and some of the keys stuck when you pressed them down, but it was Toby's favorite thing in the world. His grandmother was the one who taught him. She had played in churches for years before she got too sick to leave her chair. She taught Toby how to hold his hands, like he was holding a small orange underneath his palms, so his fingers would curve nicely. She taught him to read the black dots on the paper lines, turning them into music in his head. Since his grandmother got sick, the house had been very quiet. His mother was always tired from working 2 jobs, and there wasn't much money for lessons or new music books. So, Toby would sit at the old piano and play the songs his grandmother taught him, remembering the sound of her voice telling him to feel the music, not just play it. Playing the piano made him feel close to her. It was the only time he didn't feel small or scared about how sick she was getting now. Sitting in this noisy, fancy hall, watching the man on the stage, Toby felt a strong itch in his fingers. He wanted to run up there. He wanted to sit on that bench and hear what that big black piano sounded like. He imagined that the notes would sound richer and deeper than his old piano at home. He wondered what it would feel like to press the ivory keys that looked so white and clean. The pianist finished a song with a fancy flourish, letting the final note hang in the air before standing up to take a bow. A few people clapped politely, but most of them just kept eating their dinners and talking. The man walked off the stage, heading toward the bar at the side of the room to get a drink of water. The piano sat there alone. Toby looked around the room. His mother was far away at the kitchen doors, carrying a heavy tray. She looked busy. No one was paying any attention to him. He looked back at the piano. It was calling to him. It was like a magnet pulling at his chest. He took a deep breath, his heart starting to beat faster. He knew he wasn't supposed to leave his chair. He knew he wasn't supposed to bother the party guests. But the music was bubbling up inside him, and he felt like he might explode if he didn't let it out. He slid off the velvet chair, his shoes hitting the carpet with a soft thump. He wiped his sweaty palms on his pants. He felt very small as he began to walk between the tables. The room seemed so much bigger when you were walking through it. He navigated around a waiter pouring wine and squeezed past a lady in a large blue dress. He kept his head down, hoping no one would stop him and ask him where his parents were. As he got closer to the front, the piano looked even bigger. It towered over him. The polished wood was so shiny, he could see his own reflection in it as he approached the steps leading up to the stage. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. This was it. If he went up there, people would definitely see him. They might laugh. They might get mad. But Toby remembered what his grandmother used to say. She used to say that music was a gift, and you had to share it when you had the chance. She said, "Don't hide your light, Toby." He looked for the person in charge. He saw a woman standing near the stage holding a clipboard. She looked important, checking things off a list. She looked like the kind of person who would know if he was allowed to play. Toby's legs felt a little shaky, like jelly, but he climbed the 3 steps up to the platform. The carpet on the stage was softer than the floor, and it muffled his footsteps. He walked up to the woman. She was older, with strict glasses and a tight bun of gray hair. She was frowning at her list, looking annoyed about something. Toby stood next to her, waiting for her to notice him. The crowd noise was loud, people laughing and glasses clinking, but up here on the stage, it felt separate, like an island. The woman felt a small tug on the hem of her jacket. She looked down, expecting to see a waiter or maybe a lost coat check ticket. Instead, she saw a little boy in a slightly too tight shirt, staring up at her with wide, serious eyes. Toby swallowed hard. His mouth felt dry. He looked up at her, his voice quiet but steady. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "May I please play the piano?" The woman blinked. She looked at the boy, then at the empty piano bench, then back at the boy. A smile started to form on her face, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of smile adults gave when they thought a child was being cute or silly. She let out a short, sharp laugh. "Play?" she asked, raising her eyebrows so high they disappeared behind her bangs. "You want to play that?" "Yes, ma'am," Toby said softly. "I know how." The woman laughed again, a little louder this time. A couple at the nearest table turned their heads to see what was going on. The woman shook her head, still smiling that condescending smile. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "That isn't a toy. That is a very expensive instrument. Go sit back down before you break something." The woman's laughter wasn't mean exactly, but it was loud enough to cut through the hum of the dinner conversation. It was a sharp, barking sound that made Toby flinch. He stood his ground, though clutching his hands together in front of him. He was used to adults not taking him seriously. He was small for his age, and he had a round face that made people want to pinch his cheeks rather than listen to what he had to say. But inside, he felt serious. He wasn't trying to be cute, and he certainly didn't think the piano was a toy. "It's not a toy, ma'am," Toby said, his voice trembling just a little bit. He tried to make it sound firm, like his mother did when she told him to do his homework. "I know how to play. I promise I won't break it." The woman with the clipboard sighed. She looked tired, and she clearly didn't have time for a little boy who was wandering away from his parents. She adjusted her glasses and looked down her nose at him. "Listen, champ," she said, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "This is a private event. The guests are eating. They don't want to hear a child banging on the keys. Go on now. Back to your seat." She turned her shoulder to him, effectively dismissing him. She expected him to scurry away, embarrassed. Most kids would have. The air in the room felt heavy, filled with the smell of roast chicken and the low murmur of people talking about business and vacations. Toby felt a hot flush rising up his neck. He knew he shouldn't make a scene. His mother always told him that good boys were seen and not heard, but the piano was right there. It was so close he could smell the lemon polish they used on the wood. He took a small step closer to the woman. "Please," he whispered. "Just one song." "I play very good." The woman didn't even look down this time. She just waved her hand in a shooing motion, like she was trying to swat away a fly. By now, the people at the nearest table had stopped eating. They were watching the interaction. It was more interesting than their salads. There was a man in a dark tuxedo sitting with a woman in a sparkly gold dress. The man took a sip of his wine and chuckled softly. "Better do as she says, son," the man called out, grinning. "She's the boss. And that piano bites if you touch it wrong." The woman in the gold dress giggled behind her hand. She looked at Toby with pity, but mostly she looked amused. "He's adorable," she whispered to her husband, though Toby could hear her. "Imagine thinking he could play that thing. It's bigger than he is." A few other people at nearby tables overheard the commotion and turned to look. More chuckles rippled through the room. It wasn't cruel laughter, but it was the laughter of adults who underestimated a child. To them, Toby was just a cute interruption to their evening. They saw a kid in a stiff shirt asking to drive a car or fly a plane. It was a joke. Toby felt his face getting hot. He looked at his shoes. He felt very small, and the room felt very big. The laughter buzzed in his ears like a hive of bees. He wanted to run back to his chair and hide. He wanted to disappear into the velvet curtains. But then he looked up at the piano keys again. They were white and black, waiting silently. They didn't laugh. They didn't judge. They just waited for someone to wake them up. He thought about his grandmother at home, probably lying in her bed, staring at the ceiling. She taught him to be brave. She taught him that music was a voice for people who didn't have one. He didn't move. The woman with the clipboard realized he was still standing there. She turned around, her annoyance flaring up into anger. "Did you hear me?" she asked, her voice getting sharper. "I said go. You are bothering the guests." "I am not bothering," Toby said, surprising himself. He looked her right in the eye. "I just want to play. I won't be loud." The man at the table laughed louder this time. "Oh, let the kid try," he joked, nudging his wife. "It might be entertaining. Better than the speeches later." "It is not a comedy show," the woman snapped at the man, then glared back at Toby. "This is your last warning. Go sit down, or I will find your mother and have her take you home." Toby's stomach twisted into a knot. He didn't want to get his mother in trouble. She needed this job. He knew he was pushing his luck, maybe too far. He lowered his head and scuffed the carpet with his shoe. He felt the tears prickling at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away. He wouldn't cry, not here. Not in front of all these rich people eating their fancy dinners. He took a slow step backward, away from the woman. She huffed, satisfied that she had one, and turned back to her list. The guests at the table went back to their food, smiling at each other as if they had just enjoyed a private joke. The moment was over. The entertainment was done. Toby was just a memory again. But Toby didn't go back to his chair. He couldn't. He moved sideways instead, staying near the edge of the stage, his eyes still locked on the piano. He felt like a magnet was pulling him. He just needed one person to say yes. Just one. It was then that the older pianist came back from the bar. He walked slowly, holding a glass of water with a calm, steady hand. He had taken off his jacket and draped it over his arm, and his tie was loosened slightly. He looked like a man who had seen a lot of parties in his life. He had heard the laughter and the woman's sharp voice, but he hadn't hurried. He moved at his own pace. He stopped at the bottom of the steps leading up to the stage. He watched the woman with the clipboard checking off items, and then he looked at Toby. The pianist didn't smile, and he didn't laugh. He just watched the boy. He saw the way Toby was standing shoulders back, hands clenched, staring at the piano with a hunger that most people didn't have. The pianist had been playing for 50 years. He knew the difference between a kid who wanted to make noise and a kid who needed to make music. "Is there a problem?" the pianist asked. His voice was gravelly and deep, like distant thunder. The woman jumped, not realizing he was there. She smoothed down her skirt and put on a professional smile. No problem at all," she said quickly. "This little fellow just thought he was a concert pianist. I was just sending him back to his parents." Just a bit of confusion. The pianist nodded slowly. He took a sip of his water. He looked at the woman, then back at Toby. He asked to play. "Yes," the woman said, rolling her eyes slightly. Imagine. He's tiny. He probably can't even reach the pedals. I told him it wasn't a toy. He knows it isn't a toy, the pianist said quietly. The woman laughed nervously. Well, regardless, we can't have children disrupting the flow of the evening. The guests are dining. Let him play, the pianist said. The laughter in the room seemed to stop instantly. The woman's mouth fell open slightly. She stared at the pianist as if he had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Excuse me? Let him play, the pianist repeated, a little louder this time. He walked up the steps and stood next to Toby. He was tall and stooped, but next to Toby, he looked like a giant. He looked down at the boy. Do you know how to treat the instrument? He asked Toby. Toby nodded vigorously. Yes, sir. I wash my hands. I don't bang. I use my fingers, not my fists. The pianist's eyes crinkled at the corners. He seemed to approve of this answer. And what do you want to play? Chopin, Toby said simply. The E minor prelude. The woman gasped. That is impossible, she sputtered. He can't even pronounce it properly, I bet. Look at him. He's a baby. The pianist ignored her. He looked out at the room. The guests were watching now. The man in the tuxedo had put his fork down. The room was buzzing with whispers. People were craning their necks to see the stage. They sensed a disruption. They sensed a show. It is a difficult piece, the pianist said gently to Toby. Are you sure? I play it for my grandma, Toby said softly, when she hurts. The pianist didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the boy, really looked at him. He saw the worn shirt cuffs and the serious eyes. He saw a soul that was old and young at the same time. He turned to the woman. Give him 5 minutes, he said. If he is bad, I will stop him. This is highly irregular, the woman hissed, looking around at the guests. The organizer will hear about this. Let them hear, the pianist said. He gestured toward the bench. Go ahead, son. Toby felt like his heart was going to beat right out of his chest. This was it, the chance he had wanted. He walked over to the massive black bench. It was adjusted for a tall man, so it was sitting high. Toby had to climb up, scooting forward until his legs were dangling over the edge, nowhere near the gold pedals on the floor. It looked comical. The man in the tuxedo snorted into his napkin. Toby didn't care. He reached up and straightened the music rack, even though he didn't need music. He took a deep breath. The air smelled of wood, wax, and dust. He placed his small, pale hands on the keys. They felt cool and smooth. He closed his eyes for a second, hearing his grandmother's voice in his ear. Feel the music, Toby. Let it flow. The room was deadly silent now. The clinking of silverware had stopped completely. Even the servers had paused to watch. Everyone was waiting. They were waiting for the joke. They were waiting for the awful noise that would prove the little boy didn't belong. Toby could feel their skepticism pressing down on him like a heavy weight. He knew they were laughing inside. He didn't care. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for the quiet room at home. He was playing for the grandmother who couldn't be here. He pressed down a chord. The first sound that came out of the piano was not the clumsy banging everyone expected. It was a single deep note that rang out like a bell in a church tower, clear and sustained. Toby let it hang in the air for a moment, his small hand pressing the key down firmly but gently. The vibration seemed to shake the dust off the rafters. In that split second, the atmosphere in the banquet hall shifted. The smirks didn't exactly disappear, but they froze on people's faces. It was a sound that demanded respect. Toby didn't rush. He knew that rushing was how mistakes happened. At home, on the old upright that smelled like mothballs, his grandmother used to tap his knee with a ruler if he played too fast. Music has to breathe, Toby, she would say in her raspy voice. Let the notes breathe. So, he waited. He took a slow breath in through his nose, feeling the cool air. And then he let his fingers find the next position. He started the melody. It wasn't a simple nursery rhyme. It was the complex, wandering tune of the Chopin prelude. His right hand began to move across the white keys, playing the notes that climbed up like a ladder and then tumbled back down. The motion was fluid. His fingers were curved just the way he was taught, looking like little spiders dancing on the ivory. At first, the audience held its breath, waiting for the crash, waiting for the moment when the little boy would lose his place and hit a wrong note. But the crash didn't come. The music that poured out of the instrument was haunting. It was sad and beautiful all at the same time. Because Toby couldn't reach the pedals on the floor, he couldn't make the notes sustain as long as they were supposed to, so he had to be clever. He used his fingers to connect the notes as smoothly as silk, jumping from one chord to the next with a speed that was shocking. The man in the tuxedo, who had been laughing only a minute ago, slowly lowered his wine glass to the table. His mouth opened just a little bit. He looked at his wife, who was staring at the stage with wide eyes. They both knew this piece of music. They knew it was difficult. They knew adults who practiced for years and couldn't make it sound like this. Toby was lost in his own world by now. He couldn't see the guests anymore. He couldn't see the fancy lights or the crystal glasses. In his mind, he was back in his living room. The shiny grand piano beneath his hands transformed into the scratched, familiar keys of home. He wasn't thinking about the people judging his clothes or his size. He was thinking about the feeling of the music. The Chopin Prelude was a piece of music that felt like rain falling on a roof, even though there was no rain here. It felt like saying goodbye to someone you love. His left hand began to play the bass notes, supporting the melody. The sound grew louder and fuller. The big piano, which had looked like a sleeping monster, was now roaring to life under his control. The wood seemed to hum against his back. He swayed slightly from side to side, his body moving with the rhythm naturally. Didn't have to force it. The music was pulling him along. In the back of the room, a server stopped pouring water. Stood frozen, the pitcher hovering over a glass, completely captivated. Even the woman with the clipboard stopped checking off her items. She stood near the edge of the stage, her arms crossed over her chest, a frown etched onto her face. But she wasn't frowning in anger anymore. She was frowning in concentration, trying to figure out how this was possible. She looked from Toby's small swinging legs to his flying hands, trying to make sense of the disconnect. It looked like a trick, like a doll playing itself. But the sound was undeniably human and full of emotion. The middle section of the song grew more intense. Toby's eyebrows furrowed together. He was hitting the keys harder now, putting his whole body into the difficult chords. The sound filled the huge hall, bouncing off the walls and ceiling. It was so loud that it drowned out the hum of the air conditioner and the traffic outside. The guests forgot about their dinners completely. The salad on their plates began to wilt as they watched, spellbound. Nobody was whispering anymore. The earlier laughter felt like a distant memory, an embarrassing thing that had happened in another life. No one thought this was funny anymore. It was starting to feel like a privilege to be listening to it. The guests began to realize that this wasn't just a kid playing. This was a prodigy. This was someone who had a gift that couldn't be taught in a school. You either had it or you didn't, and this boy had it in buckets. Toby didn't know he was a prodigy. He only knew that when he played, the heavy feeling in his chest got lighter. He thought about his grandmother's hands, how they used to be strong and fast, and how they were now weak and shaky. He played for her. He poured all his worry into the music. He played his fear that she might not get better. He played his love for her, because the music was so full of real emotion, the people in the room could feel it, even if they didn't know where it was coming from. It made some of them think of their own families. It made the man in the tuxedo think of his father. It made the woman with the gold dress wipe a stray tear from her eye, surprised by her own reaction. As the song neared its end, the tempo slowed down. The notes became softer, gentler. Toby's hands slowed their dance. He played the final, descending melody with incredible delicacy. He was being very careful. He didn't want to ruin it with a heavy hand. The last few notes were simple and quiet, dropping down into the silence like stones into a deep pool. And then there was silence. Toby lifted his hands off the keys and placed them in his lap. He sat there for a moment on the high bench, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He was out of breath. Adrenaline was rushing through his veins. For a few seconds, he just listened to the quiet of the room. It was a different kind of quiet than before. Before, the quiet was full of boredom and expectation. Now, the quiet was heavy. It was thick with awe. He didn't know what to do. He looked out at the room, his vision clearing from the trance he had been in. He saw hundreds of eyes staring at him. For a terrifying second, he thought he had done something wrong. He thought they were angry. He felt a wave of panic crash over him. Had he played too loud? Was he in trouble? He looked toward the woman with the clipboard, expecting her to yell at him to get down. But she wasn't looking at him with anger. She was staring at him with her mouth slightly open, her pen dangling forgotten from her fingers. She looked stunned. Toby looked at the man in the tuxedo. He wasn't laughing. He was sitting perfectly still, looking at Toby as if he were seeing a ghost. The silence stretched on. It lasted 5 seconds, then 10 seconds. It felt like an eternity to Toby. He wanted to jump off the bench and run back to his table. He felt exposed. He felt like he had poured his heart out and had it rejected. His lower lip started to tremble, just a little bit. He gripped the edge of the bench, ready to make his escape. Then, a sound came from the back of the room. It was the sound of one person clapping. It wasn't polite applause. It was a slow, rhythmic clap. Toby looked to see who it was. It was the pianist, the older man in the loosened tie. He was standing near the bar, clapping his hands together, a proud smile on his face. He nodded at Toby, a deep, respectful nod. That sound broke the spell. Like a dam breaking, the rest of the room erupted. It started as a murmur, but within seconds, it was a roar. People at the front tables stood up first. Then the people behind them stood up, trying to see over the heads of the others. The applause wasn't just clapping. It was accompanied by cheers and whistles. The woman in the gold dress was clapping. So hard her hands must have stung, and she was beaming through her tears. The man in the tuxedo was shouting "Bravo!" At the top of his lungs, the noise washed over Toby like a warm wave. He realized they weren't angry. They were happy. They liked it. They really liked it. He sat there on the bench, blinking in the bright lights, a shy smile slowly spreading across his face. He didn't stand up to take a bow. He didn't know how to act like a star. Just sat there, a little boy on a big chair, accepting the love of the room. The woman with the clipboard walked over to him. She didn't look annoyed anymore. She looked flustered and a little bit amazed. She reached out and gently touched Toby's shoulder, leaning down so he could hear her over the noise. You were wonderful," she stammered, as if she couldn't believe she was saying it. "Absolutely wonderful." Toby looked up at her, his eyes shining. "Thank you," he whispered. She stepped back and clapped along with everyone else. The pianist walked up onto the stage and stood next to Toby, waving to the crowd to acknowledge them, but motioning toward the boy to show them who the real star was. The applause got even louder. Toby looked through the crowd and saw his mother standing near the kitchen doors. She had dropped her tray on a side table and was covering her mouth with both hands, crying happy tears.
Ah!
She looked so proud that Toby felt his heart might burst. He gave her a small wave. She waved back, laughing and crying at the same time. The old pianist leaned down and spoke into Toby's ear. "You have a gift, son," he said sincerely. "Never let anyone tell you that you are too small to do big things." Toby nodded. He knew that now. He wasn't just the little boy who sat in the corner. He was a musician. He had shared his light, just like his grandmother told him to. And for the first time in his life, the whole world was listening. The applause didn't stop after a few seconds like it usually did for the hired musicians. It kept going, growing louder and filling the giant hall like a physical force. Toby sat on the bench, his hands resting in his lap, blushing a deep shade of red. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. At school, the kids only noticed him if he dropped his lunch tray. Here, hundreds of people were staring at him, clapping. Some were even standing up. The older pianist stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Toby's shoulder. It was a heavy, warm hand, and it felt grounding. The pianist waved his other hand toward Toby, signaling to the crowd that this small boy was the one they should be looking at. The man in the tuxedo whistled sharply, a happy sound that cut through the noise. The woman in the gold dress was wiping her eyes with a napkin, not caring that her makeup was smudging a little. Toby felt a nudge on his arm. It was the woman with the clipboard. She looked completely different now. Her strict face was soft, and she was smiling a genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She leaned down close to his ear so he could hear her over the noise. "You did a wonderful job," she said. her voice kind. "But you should take a bow. They love you." Toby looked at her, his eyes wide. "A bow? Yes, like this," she said, nodding her head. She stood up straight and demonstrated a quick dip of her upper body. "Just say thank you with your body." Toby took a deep breath. He slid forward on the bench until his feet touched the floor again. He stood up. He felt very small in front of all these people, but he also felt strong. He turned to face the room. The lights were bright, making it hard to see individual faces clearly, but he could feel them all there. He clasped his hands behind his back, just like he saw the musicians do on television, and bent forward at the waist. As soon as he dipped down, the room erupted again. It was a roar of approval. Toby stood back up straight, his face hurting a little because he was smiling so big. He did it again, another bow, because the clapping just wouldn't stop. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like the poor kid in the too-tight shirt. He felt like a king. The pianist walked over to the microphone stand that was set up near the piano. He tapped the metal top twice, causing a screeching feedback sound that made everyone cover their ears for a second. He laughed into the mic, a low, rumbling chuckle. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming through the speakers, "I have been playing for 50 years, and I have never seen anything like that. Let's give another hand for this young man." The crowd cheered again. Toby just stood there, rocking back and forth on his heels. He looked toward the back of the room and saw his mother. She was standing near the double doors that led to the kitchen, with a white towel draped over her arm. She had one hand over her mouth, and he could see her shoulders shaking. She was crying, but he knew they were happy tears. He gave her a little wave. She waved back, blowing him a kiss. "Now we have to let this young man rest his fingers," the pianist said into the microphone. "But before I go back to my set, I want to invite him to sit with me for the next song. Maybe we can play a duet. What do you say, folks?" The crowd shouted yes and clapped their hands. Toby's eyes went huge. A duet? With the professional? He hadn't practiced with anyone else. He only knew how to play alone in his living room. He looked up at the pianist, shaking his head nervously. "Don't worry," the pianist whispered to him, away from the mic. "Just follow me. If you get lost, just play the notes I play. We will do heart and soul. Everyone knows that one." Toby breathed a sigh of relief. He knew Heart and Soul was the first song his grandmother taught him. He nodded eagerly. The pianist sat back down on the bench and scooted over to make room. "Hop up," he said. Toby climbed back up. It was a tight squeeze. Two grown men would have never fit, but because Toby was so small, there was just enough space. The pianist adjusted the height of the bench with the lever under it, lifting it up so Toby could reach better. "I will play the low part, the beat," the pianist explained. "You play the high part, the melody, ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. He started the familiar rhythm. It was a bouncy, happy beat. Boom, boom, clap, boom, boom, clap. Tubby waited for his cue. When it came, his right hand jumped in. He played the notes perfectly. It was a simple song, but playing it together on a grand piano made it sound magical. They were perfectly in sync. The pianist smiled over at Toby, and Toby smiled back, his white teeth flashing. They were having fun. The audience loved it. Some people started clapping along to the beat. When they finished the song, the crowd was on their feet again. Toby felt like he was floating. He couldn't believe this was happening. Just an hour ago, he was the invisible boy in the corner. Now he was the star of the show. After the bows, the pianist leaned over. "You go back to your mom now, okay? I need to play the slow dinner music again." Toby slid off the bench. He felt a little sad to leave the piano, but his legs were tired from climbing up and down, and he was incredibly thirsty. "Thank you," Toby said to the pianist. "No," the pianist said, shaking Toby's hand. "Thank you. You reminded me why I started playing." Toby hopped down the stairs from the stage. As he walked back through the tables, the vibe was completely different. Before, people looked through him. Now, they reached out to pat his back or high-five him as he passed. The man in the tuxedo stopped him. "That was incredible, kid," the man said, sounding serious. "You have real talent." "Thank you, sir," Toby said. The woman in the gold dress handed him a fresh napkin with a chocolate on it. "Here you go, sweetie. You earned this." Toby took the chocolate. He wasn't supposed to have candy before dinner, but he figured tonight was a special exception. He shoved it into his pocket for later. He made his way all the way to the back of the room. His mother was waiting for him there. She pulled him into a hug that squeezed all the air out of his lungs. "Mom?" he gasped. "I played." "I heard you," she said, her voice cracking. "I heard every note." "Toby, that was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." "Your grandmother would have been so proud, really?" Toby asked. "They weren't mad?" "Mad? They loved you?" She laughed, wiping her eyes. Even the boss lady was smiling. Toby looked back at the stage. The pianist was playing a slow, jazzy song again. It looked so peaceful up there. "I want to do that forever, Mom," Toby said quietly. "I want to play music for people." His mother knelt down, so she was eye level with him. She smoothed his hair down and looked at him with a fierce love. "Then you will," she said. "I don't know how we will do it, but we will find a way. You have a gift, Toby. We can't waste it." A man in a suit came over to them. It wasn't one of the guests, but the man who managed the hotel. Toby felt nervous, thinking he was in trouble for leaving his seat. "Excuse me," the manager said to Toby's mother. He looked very official, with a name tag pinned to his jacket. "I heard the young man play." That was quite something. Toby's mother stood up protectively, putting a hand on Toby's shoulder. "Thank you," she said politely. "We have a lot of events here," the manager continued. "Weddings, parties, dinners. Our usual pianist is talking about retiring soon, or at least cutting back his hours." He looked down at Toby.
We don't usually hire children, obviously, but
"If he keeps practicing, and if his mother approves, I would like to keep his number. Maybe for a special performance sometime. Or perhaps we could talk about some lessons in one of our empty conference rooms." Toby's jaw dropped. "Lessons here? On the big piano?" "We don't have much money for lessons," Toby's mother said softly. "We can work something out," the manager said with a smile. "Talent like that is rare. It would be a shame to let it go unheard, just because of money." Toby looked up at his mother. Her eyes were wet again, but she was smiling the biggest smile he had ever seen. She shook the manager's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Toby stood there, holding his mother's hand. He could hear the pianist playing in the background, the music drifting through the warm air. He felt the chocolate in his pocket and the soreness in his fingers. He looked around the room at the fancy people eating their dinner, and he knew that things were going to be different now. He wasn't just the little boy who asked to play. He was a musician, and the world had finally opened its ears to listen. The rest of the evening felt like a dream to Toby, the kind where you float around and nothing seems real. When his shift ended, his mother took his hand, and they walked out of the hotel together. The cool night air hit Toby's face, waking him up a little bit. The city was busy with cars driving by and streetlights glowing, but Toby felt like he was walking in his own bubble of happiness. They didn't take the bus that night. Instead, the hotel manager called them a taxi, paid for by the hotel as a thank you. Toby sat in the back seat, pressing his nose against the glass, watching the lights blur by. He held his mother's hand tight, and she squeezed his hand back every few seconds, just to make sure he was really there. When they finally walked through the front door of their small apartment, the familiar smell of soup and old furniture welcomed them home. It was a tiny place, much smaller than the grand hall, but it felt warm and safe. His grandmother was sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, wrapped in a knitted blanket. She looked tired and frail, her eyes half closed, but she looked up when they came in. "You're back late," she said, her voice raspy and quiet. "Did you behave, Toby?" Toby's mother helped the grandmother sit up straighter. "He did more than behave, Mama," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "You won't believe what he did." Toby walked over to the old upright piano that sat against the wall in the living room. It looked so small compared to the shiny black monster at the hotel. The wood was scratched, and one of the keys was chipped. But looking at it now, Toby didn't see a beat-up old instrument. He saw his best friend. He saw where his journey began. "Grandma," Toby said softly, "I played for people tonight. A lot of people. grandmother smiled, a slow, wrinkly smile. Did you? That is nice, Toby. Did you play Twinkle Twinkle? No, Toby said, shaking his head. I played Chopin, the one you taught me. The E minor one. His grandmother's eyes opened wide. She looked at her daughter, who was nodding vigorously. He did, his mother said. He played on a real grand piano. He was amazing. Everyone clapped. Mama. Everyone stood up. The hotel manager even said he might help us with lessons. The grandmother let out a long breath. She reached out her shaking hand toward Toby. Toby took it and sat on the stool next to her chair. My boy, she whispered, I knew you had it in you. I knew the music was inside you, waiting to get out. I am so sorry I wasn't there to see it. It's okay, Toby said, rubbing her hand with his thumb. I played for you. I was thinking about you the whole time. Play it for me now, she said. Here, just a little bit. Toby looked at his mother. She nodded and sat down on the sofa, wiping her face with a towel. Toby turned back to the piano. He lifted the fallboard that covered the keys. The silence in the small apartment was heavy, waiting for the sound. Toby closed his eyes for a second. He could still see the bright lights of the hotel, feel the smoothness of the ivory keys, and hear the roar of the crowd. But when he put his fingers on the keys of the old piano, he realized something important. The feeling in his chest was the same. The magic didn't come from the expensive wood or the crystal chandeliers. The magic came from him. He took a deep breath and started to play. The old piano made a different sound, more percussive. A little tinny compared to the hotel instrument, but the notes were still true. Toby poured his heart into the song, just like he did earlier. He played the sad, beautiful melody. He swayed side to side. His grandmother closed her eyes and let her head rest against the back of the chair, listening to the music float through the room. It was a peaceful moment, a perfect moment. Over the next few months, things changed for Toby and his family, but they changed in a slow and steady way, like the sun rising in the morning. It wasn't an instant fairy tale where everything became perfect overnight. His grandmother was still sick, and money was still tight, but the heavy cloud of sadness that hung over the apartment seemed to lift a little bit. True to his word, the hotel manager arranged for Toby to use the hotel's practice rooms on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. It was Toby's favorite time of the week. He would pack his school bag and go to the big hotel. The staff knew him now. The woman with the clipboard always waved at him and sometimes gave him a cookie from the kitchen. The older pianist, Mr. Arthur, became his mentor. He didn't just teach Toby notes. He taught him how to feel the music, how to play with his whole soul. Toby practiced hard. He was a good student because he loved it. He didn't see it as work. He saw it as flying. One Saturday afternoon, the hotel hosted a special charity event. It was a big deal. There were flowers everywhere. People were dressed up even fancier than before. Mr. Arthur had asked Toby to be the opening act. Just one piece to start the show. Toby stood backstage, peeking through the heavy curtains. He was wearing a new suit that his mother had bought him. It fit perfectly this time. His shoes were shiny, and his hair was combed neatly. He wasn't the scared little boy hiding in the corner anymore. He stood tall, his shoulders back. He wasn't nervous, but he was excited. He felt a quiet confidence buzzing in his veins. "Ready, son?" Mr. Arthur asked, standing next to him. "Ready," Toby said, smiling. The lights in the hall dimmed. The host announced his name. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our very special guest, a young talent with an old soul, Toby." Toby walked out onto the stage. The spotlight hit him, bright and warm. He walked to the center of the stage and bowed. The room was full, but he didn't see strangers anymore. He saw people who were there to listen. He sat down at the grand piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. He played a piece by Mozart. It was fast and happy, full of running notes that sounded like a river flowing downstream. His fingers moved like lightning, dancing over the keys. He didn't miss a single note. He played with a joy that was infectious. Looking out into the crowd, he could see people smiling. He saw the man in the tuxedo and the woman in the gold dress, and they were clapping along in their seats. But most importantly, sitting right in the front row, he saw his mother and his grandmother. They had brought her in a wheelchair because she didn't want to miss this night. His grandmother was clapping her hands slowly, her eyes shining with tears of pride. Toby played just for her. He sent every note of love and gratitude right to her heart. When he finished the final chord, the room exploded. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a thunderstorm of cheers. Toby stood up and took his bow. He looked at his grandmother and she blew him a kiss. Toby felt a warmth spread through his chest that was better than any applause. He knew that no matter how big the stages got or how famous he might become, he would always be that little boy who loved music because it brought his family together, backstage. After the show, his mother hugged him so hard she almost squeezed the stuffing out of him. "I'm so proud of you. Toby, I'm so proud," she kept saying. His grandmother wheeled herself over and took his hand. "You have a gift, Toby," she said, her voice weak but full of love. "Never forget where you came from. Never forget that music is about love. As long as you play with love, you will never be alone." "I won't, Grandma," Toby promised, kneeling down to kiss her cheek. "I won't." That night, as Toby lay in his bed, listening to the sounds of the city outside his window, he thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the people who laughed at him that first night and how their laughter turned into cheers. He realized that sometimes people laugh because they don't know any better. They judge you by how you look or how small you are. But if you are brave enough to show them who you really are, you can change their minds. He closed his eyes and imagined the piano keys in his mind. He imagined the music playing on, never ending. He wasn't just a poor kid from the city anymore. He was Toby the pianist, and the world was ready to listen. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem scary. It seemed bright, like a song that was just beginning. And Toby couldn't wait to play the next note. He drifted off to sleep with a smile on his face, dreaming of black and white keys and the sound of applause that sounded just like love.